Hello, welcome to all of you. I'm Susan Jakes. I am the editor of ChinaFile, which is an online magazine published by Asia Society's Center on U.S.-China Relations. But I'm here today in my more all-purpose role as an avid consumer and admirer of the work of my colleagues, once upon a time my downstairs neighbors, at the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York. And I'm deeply grateful to them for inviting me to take part in the unveiling of a superb piece of new research conducted by ASPI's Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy, Daniel Russel, along with Senior Program Officer Blake Berger, and laid out with clarity and exceptional elegance in their new report, Weaponizing the Belt and Road. Since its debut in 2013 at the dawn of Xi Jinping's tenure, when it was called One Belt, One Road, China's Belt and Road Initiative has proved an elusive quarry for researchers and policymakers trying to make sense of its intentions and its impacts. It's now a sprawling collection of infrastructure and development projects spanning 140 countries and with a 1 trillion and counting price tag. At the beginning, it looked to many observers like a kind of political rebranding exercise. People wondered if it was just Xi Jinping's new linguistically bewildering label for activities China was already undertaking in the region, with the belt along the old Silk Road and the road going through the waters of Southeast Asia. It was confusing. The past 7 years have offered us vast new stores of information, the accretion often of literally concrete details in the form of built projects, official statements, meetings of the Belt and Road Forum. And yet, as the program has expanded and taken hold, it's remained a kind of blur, leading even some of the most astute experts of the region to puzzlement over where, for example, ordinary Chinese foreign policy ends and the Belt and Road begins. And what makes Danny and Blake's report so impressive and vital is the way it cuts through this fog to give us a focused view, not only of the key pieces of this huge complex of entities and processes, but also how they're woven together. So before I ask Danny to elaborate a little bit, I'd like to introduce you to his fellow panelists, each of whom brings expertise not only to the specific subject of the report, but also to the broader questions it raises about China's changing position in the Indo-Pacific and in the wider world. It's an honor to have with us Admiral Scott Swift, who began his 4 decades of distinguished and decorated service in the United States Navy as a fighter pilot and concluded them as commander of the Pacific Fleet from 2015 until his retirement in 2018. Also joining us from Arlington is Elina Noor, for whom this program is not only a report launch, but also her own launch as ASPI's new director for political security affairs. Elina officially joined Asia Society yesterday, and Danny gave her a full 24 hours to get her bearings before graciously throwing her this Belt and Road themed welcome reception. Some people send a fruit basket, but kidding aside, we are all thrilled to have Elina as a new colleague. She's an expert on international security and international law as they operate particularly in Southeast Asia and in cyberspace. And she comes to Asia Society most recently from the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu. A couple of notes about our format before I turn it over to Danny. First of all, I predict after hearing more about it, you'll all want to read the full text of Weaponizing the Belt and Road, and you'll be able to find it easily on the Asia Society Policy Institute website. The 4 of us are going to now talk for roughly 40 minutes, and after that, I will open the floor to questions. So at any time during the discussion, as soon as now, if you'd like, you can post questions using the comment function on either Facebook or YouTube, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. So now I'd like to turn things over to Danny for an overview of his findings, Danny, as you know, was a career Foreign Service officer who ran Asia policy on the National Security Council and then served as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs during the Obama administration. So Danny, start us off with a sense of how you embarked on this grand inquiry.
Well, the elusive quarry. I love it. Thank you very much, Susie. That was a wonderful scene setter, and it's great for me to join you and Elina and my old friend and colleague and traveling partner, Admiral Scott Swift. I hope someone in the audience will use the Q&A function to ask him what his Navy call sign was. And I also want to start by thanking my colleague Blake Berger, who was a great partner in the BRI projects that we've done. So, as far as the inception of this hunt for the elusive quarry, I've always called the Belt and Road Initiative a Rorschach test, an inkblot test, because people see such different things when they look at it, depending on who they are and where they're coming from. Last summer, Blake and I did a report called Navigating the Belt and Road that looked at the social and economic aspects and problems in the initiative. And, then as well as now, the Chinese characterization of Belt and Road is always that it's a win-win cooperative international infrastructure program involving, 140 countries, bringing prosperity, bringing development to now every corner of the globe. I'll confess to a certain degree of skepticism there. At the same time, in many Western capitals, the view of Belt and Road is that it's a dangerous Trojan horse, that it traps countries under a mountain of debt and corruption, environmental damage, and that in particular, China's voracious appetite for ports all around the world means that it's embarked on a project to create a quote unquote string of pearls, a string of naval bases at strategic junctures around the Indian Ocean, around the Pacific, that it is going to use to try to achieve military domination in the Indo-Pacific. I was a bit skeptical of that too, so I decided to take a closer look specifically at the military dimensions of the Belt and Road, whatever they might be. Now, Chinese officials go to great pains to deny that there's any military motive behind BRI. And the Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army, PLA, is taken quite a low profile, frankly. But what we found is that China has a doctrine of military-civil fusion, and its laws actually mandate that overseas infrastructure projects be designed to meet PLA standards, and so in the case of ports, to accommodate PLA Navy ships. There's also a documented civilian first, military later strategy by the Chinese government that seems to aim to lay the groundwork for eventual military utilization of facilities, but to do it in a way that doesn't raise a lot of red flags. And typically we've found that the Chinese negotiate for operational control of port management by a Chinese company, and they frequently build in and bring in support industries to service Chinese ships, and that can include naval ships. We found a number of the major port projects, including the four key projects that we studied, one in Pakistan, one in Sri Lanka, one in Cambodia, one in Myanmar, that were strategically located along the key sea lanes and then the choke points. And it turns out that the Chinese themselves have a name for them. They refer to these facilities as, quote, strategic strong points. There should be like ominous music blaring in the background right now because it sounds kind of scary. It sounds like a fortress. So, question, are the warnings right about Chinese nefarious plan to create the string of pearls, naval and military bases around the Indo-Pacific. Well, where we came out was not exactly. Admiral Swift can explain better than I can how BRI ports can extend the reach of the PLA Navy, but there was simply no evidence that China is building these facilities in a way that could be defended. They're all quite vulnerable. They're not military bases the way that Americans think of them. They're not designed for war fighting. They aren't like Yokosuka or what Subic Bay used to be. So I guess everybody can just chillax, right? Well, what we found was that when you take a step back and look at how all the pieces fit together, the picture that swims into view is actually rather concerning. Susie, as you mentioned, Belt and Road has a lot of different roads, a lot of different belts. You got the Silk Economic Belt, you've got the maritime, the continental, the health, the digital Silk Roads. You've got the BRI Space Information Corridor. And on top of that, you've got all the other more traditional Chinese lines of effort: diplomatic, political, commercial, financial, technological, informational. You've got loans, you've got aid, you've got trade, disaster relief, high-level diplomacy, arms sales, and a few other kind of not so genteel tactics. You've got the push to export Chinese standards, Chinese technology, everything from Huawei and 5G networks to smart city surveillance systems to the Beidou satellite network, kind of Chinese GPS. And quite apart from mining big data, which is not a trivial advantage, quite apart from intelligence collection, that sort of thing, these tech platforms create new forms of dependency on China. And let's face it, dependence is leverage for China. So the takeaway from all this is that these many strands of BRI are being woven into a network, a kind of fabric of influence, dare I say, a kind of sphere of influence. Now, I'm not saying that it is all necessarily by design, that it's a, diabolical master plan hatched, deep in the bowels of Jonanhai. But I'm also certainly not suggesting that it's something that countries in the region are comfortable with. What I am saying is it's happening. And the trend is toward an increasingly Chinese influenced, Chinese dominated political, economic, technological, and strategic ecosystem in the Indo-Pacific. And the issue isn't really so much that BRI boosts the PLA's military capabilities. If that's all we're looking at, we're going to be badly misled. The issue is that it boosts Beijing's leverage over countries in the region and creates a dynamic that makes it harder and harder for the United States and for other Western countries to operate freely in the region across a range of sectors and domains. And the worse that tensions become between Washington and Beijing, the more reluctant other countries could become to do things like grant us access and overflight rights if things get dicey. But this issue goes well beyond security. I think that this trend, BRI-driven trend, is causing more hedging in the region. It's making it harder for the U.S. to get political cooperation as well, and potentially costing us economic opportunities as well. Now, I don't want to overstate the case. It is by no means a foregone conclusion that we're inevitably going to wind up with a clearly Sino-centric Indo-Pacific. But I do believe that the region isn't just going to rebalance itself, that without smart policies by Washington in particular, and by very active engagement by the United States, active engagement across the spectrum of what the nation does, so well beyond what the Seventh Fleet can do by itself. I think then, without that, then this trend, this weaponization of the Belt and Road, so to speak, this trend is likely to accelerate. Back to you, Susie.
I was on mute. Thanks so much, Danny. That was a really terrific and interview. Covered so much, overview, covered so much ground. Okay. I'd like to turn now to you, Admiral Swift, for your thoughts on how this changing matrix of leverage in its commercial and military dimensions affects our military interests in the region, and how should we understand a little bit more concretely what kinds of risks or just costs it poses for the U.S. Presence in the region?
Well, thanks for that question, and thanks to the Asia Society as well for teeing up this opportunity to share some thoughts and to help launch this important work. Before I answer the question directly, I think that it is very important to read this paper on the Belt and Road in the broader context of what it means with respect to China's strategy. And the reason I say that, in my view, it's important not to prioritize the various efforts from a strategic perspective of who works to look after U.S. interests, and in this case, in the Indo-Asia Pacific region. And I think it comes out in the paper that points out what a critical role the PLA is playing in the Belt and Road Initiative. But to your question, Susie, it's also important to underscore that China has a whole of government approach. And perhaps it's easier for me to say, as someone who spent a lot of time in the military, that I am concerned that our approach, we tend to lead with our military foot. And I think it's important that we lead with our diplomatic foot. We've heard this many times when General Mattis was the Secretary of Defense, and the issue that was being focused on at the time was North Korea. And he continued to stress over and over again how state had the lead. Secretary Tillerson had the lead in dealing with North Korea, that he had a supporting role. That said, to Danny's point, it's important that we're not ignorant as to an element that the PLA is playing. It's certainly in the news today about the size of the PLAN, the People's Liberation Army Navy, that it's a peer of the U.S. Navy. Well, we need to be careful about how we calculate size and strength. So I've been describing certainly China as a peer for at least the last 5 years. Now you can pick areas where they have overmatch. You can pick other areas where others have overmatch. But I think that the broad strategic vision that China has, certainly for the region, there's an expectation, and Xi Jinping and the Communist Party has been clear about this, an expectation that there's a critical role for the PLA to play. And I think that's what comes out in this paper. So I think we ignore it, as Danny said, at our peril. But at the same time, we can't afford just to focus on that military piece. We need to focus more broadly.
All right. Well, we'll at least try to do that in our discussion, in part by now trying to weave in the economic strand of this fabric that Danny described. Elina, allowing for the fact that a central argument and a compelling argument of this research is that none of the sectors of human activity that BRI encompasses can be neatly separated from the others. I want to look for a minute at economics, and I wonder if you could sketch out briefly what the costs, particularly in the form of indebtedness, are, and what the economic benefits are for Southeast Asian BRI host countries. I know that's a giant question. Take whichever piece of it you want.
Thank you, Susan. I'll try my best. So to preface things, I'm not an economist, but I will try to outline what it means for Southeast Asian states in terms of not only indebtedness, but also future leverage that China might have over some of these countries with all those pieces of puzzle, or when all those pieces of puzzle come together, if they do. I think the experience in Southeast Asia has shown that if the host governments are capable in negotiating these BRI contracts to their advantage, or even to renegotiate them in certain cases, such as in Malaysia's case, the Chinese would be willing to meet some of these governments halfway. And I think another lesson from the region is that if these host governments are very firm on what they want out of these infrastructural projects, and if they are able through their enterprises or through other private sector companies that are operating in their countries to negotiate terms that are favorable, Chinese like to use the term win-win to both sides, but preferably on equitable terms, then the host country can actually come out on equal, if not proportionate terms to what they were looking for out of these projects in the first place. I think one of the key benefits and values of this report is that it throws out all these pieces, as you mentioned, not only through the satellite system, BeiDou, but also through technologies like 5G, through ports and railroads and other elements of connectivity that a lot of these Southeast Asian countries need. You begin to see a picture of what it might look like in the future were these countries to depend on only one vendor or supplier, which in this case would be China. And I think going forward, what you will continue to see, as with other areas in the past, many of these Southeast Asian countries, as Danny has said, will try to hedge, but not only hedge, will try to have to manage the interoperability issues. For example, with 5G and the smart cities network in ASEAN. A number of these vendors and suppliers are Western companies. Many of them have had long-standing relationships with the host governments. But now you see the Chinese players come in, and in a big way, because there is this pull factor within Southeast Asia. So it's a supply-demand issue. Going back to your point about economics, there's a push factor from the Chinese side with a market saturation for many of these tech companies. But there's also a pull factor in Southeast Asia because so much of this infrastructure is demand-driven. I'll stop here, so please feel free to tease out some of those if I haven't addressed your question.
Maybe Danny.
Hey, Susie,
oh yeah,
I'd love to jump in because I think Elina made some tremendously important points, and I think I think the key in part is that the big variable here is the capacity of the target governments, the recipient governments of BRI projects, to be able to adequately defend their own interests. And the region is replete with examples of governments that could and governments that couldn't. And spoiler alert, that points a big arrow towards something very important that Western governments can do, which is to bolster the capacity of smaller developing countries to insist on projects meeting international standards, insist on transparency, those sorts of things. Now, debt is only a small fraction of the aggregate of BRI even in the economic sense. And I don't happen to buy the, debt trap motif as the deliberate strategy that China is pursuing. But at the same time, I know from experience that China is not one to leave a lot of leverage on the table. And even before COVID, debt to China as a percentage of GDP is very, very high in the developing world. And in Myanmar, I think it's something incredible, like 40%. Cambodia, over 20%. Sri Lanka, just shy of 10%. Pakistan, which is a much bigger economy, 7%. And Pakistan, Sri Lanka, these countries are high-risk borrowers. They don't have a lot of options. So even before COVID-19, these countries were struggling, and China had leverage. Now, in the aftermath of COVID, we can talk about that further. You've seen quite a few developing countries just flat out unable to service their existing debts to China. And so what is that going to lead to?
Let's talk about what it might lead to. I think another interesting thing about the report is that you guys, the authors, make a nice distinction between ways in which we can see these new levers that China has at its disposal having effects right now, and then also thinks into the future about what kinds of potential leverage they might produce going forward. So maybe we can just take a moment for each of you to, or any of you that want to just talk about where you see this influence being wielded now. What are some of the concrete effects that you've identified in the report in terms of U.S. ability to operate in the region militarily, commercially, diplomatically?
I'll jump in, and on the military element, it does. Again, I come back to, and I think the paper does a great job in highlighting this. You have to continue to think of any of these elements, the economic or the military, the diplomatic, in a broader context, the traditional context of a grand strategy. And one of my frustrations, Danny and I have shared this discussion, and I've done some writing on this, is that I don't believe that the U.S. has a grand strategy. I think the NSS is the national security strategy is more of a strategy directed towards China, and it doesn't describe what the U.S. strategic interests are internationally, broadly, from a global perspective. I think that's the first step, and the next step is to think regionally. I think China does have that. I don't think China's interested in becoming a global military power. They're interested in looking at where they think they have key national interests, which are reflected in these Belt and Road areas of focus that they have. The interest on the military side is those that are located within, as China describes them, the first island chain and the second island chain. And I think the continuity of those investments that they're making, that are largely commercial, but backed up by military, is what's most compelling. To go way down a military rabbit hole, I think it's fair to assume, and now we see it in action, that China views that space inside the first island chain as a space where they want to make sure that they exercise a sea supremacy, which is where they have overmatch, as opposed to sea superiority, which is where it's a contested area, but they have significant controls measures that's in that space between the first and second island chain. I bring that up as an example because the Belt and Road Initiative points out something that I've believed for some time in unclassified readings of Chinese statements of their strategic views, certainly from a regional perspective. As many people think of the first island chain as originating in the Kurils and then continuing down through certainly the Philippines and down through Brunei and Malaysia. But the dialogue trails off after that. Where does it go? Well, it's clear in my mind that it continues through the Java Islands, through Sri Lanka, through the Maldives, and is anchored in Gwadar. So this is how the Belt and Road investment initiatives are reflective of a military strategy that's focused on where China feels they're most vulnerable, which is in the maritime domain. And equally, if you take a look at their interest of the second island chain, beginning in the Kurils, continuing down through Guam, the voiceover trails off after that. But if you look at the investments that are made in Port Moresby, if you look at the activity in the seas north of Australia, if you look at the interest in Diego Garcia, the Seychelles, and ultimately in Djibouti, those are the strategic significance of those investments of Djibouti. It's not just about Africa. It's this broader perspective of strategy where the military has a role to support the economic initiatives that China's employed as part of its grand strategy and regional strategy, as well as its diplomatic initiatives. They're not leading with the military, they're trailing with the military. Essentially, they're taking a playbook out of what the US strategic approach has been for a long time, which is state our national interest in the international domain, and State Department leads with looking after those interests and negotiating them. I think the negotiation is a little sharper and a little more elbows thrown as China has to make up for lost time to reach the culminating point of where they want to be with this strategy. I think before it was time-based. I think now it's become event-based, which I think is reflected in the paper. I'll pause at that point.
Susie, if I could jump in, I think Elina can speak much more expertly and articulately than I can on this, but I think that one area where we can see very concrete advantages to China and disadvantages emerging for the United States is in the cyber realm, the digital Silk Road, the space information corridor, and how they fit into the construction of these digital networks, Huawei 5G. I mentioned earlier the smart cities, surveillance, communications technology, and so on. A big part of this is standard setting, and China's embarked on a tremendously energetic campaign, both in rule-setting institutions and organizations, but then through commercial and other means to either replace or adjust, or in some cases create standards that it can determine, and create alternatives to US systems, like alternative to GPS, like a system that imposes sovereign control over data and cyberspace, the export of e-payment systems like Alipay throughout, say, Southeast Asia or South Asia, that may well be setting the stage for a digital Chinese currency and undermining, in some areas and some extent, the absolute dominance of the US dollar. But again, Elina knows far more about this area than I do. If I can hand it over to you.
Go ahead. I was just going to ask her this very question.
Again, I'll try. So as the media reported a few days ago, China proposed a set of standards for discussion on data security. And although the US was not explicitly mentioned, a lot of analysts have compared this to China's response to Secretary Pompeo's Clean Network Initiative. And I think we're talking about standards in general, particularly in the tech sector. Many Southeast Asian countries and many parts of the global South actually find appeal in some of China's arguments when it comes to data sovereignty, because a lot of countries feel that they've either been ripped off in terms of having their data mined with little compensation to them, monetary or otherwise, but also for other reasons such as political stability, regime stability if you're more cynical, but also other valid arguments related to the harmony or social harmony of these communities. And so I think what is important is to keep in mind that there is attraction and appeal to some of these Chinese governments, even in the standard setting world. And I think there is also appreciation in Southeast Asia for a diversification of options, whether in terms of technical or policy standards when it comes to how the governance framework of technology will be laid out in the future. And just a small point about some of these tech companies that are becoming increasingly large players in Southeast Asia. Again, much of this is demand driven because in the past, I think what we've seen is that US companies have been more focused on, and again, demand driven to a certain extent from within the region, on laying out the hard infrastructure. So companies like Cisco, Microsoft to a certain extent have been longtime players, as I mentioned earlier. But now you have some of the Chinese players like Alibaba catering to the e-payment, e-wallet desires in Southeast Asia. And so a lot of these Chinese players are coming in on trying to fulfill a consumer and fintech segment in Southeast Asia, which is booming because the mobile economy prospects in the region calls out to these companies. And there seems to be a natural fit between what is needed and what is offered. And so I think one of the ways which this report also points out to assist in the capacity of Southeast Asia to figure out their options is to enable other players to come in, offer not only alternatives, but also alternative thinking to what's already out there. So just in terms of not only fintech solutions, but also standards, whether there can be a third way as opposed to Beijing's way or the West's way, for lack of better characterization.
Thanks, Elina. Well, we're getting a lot of really excellent questions from the audience, and I'd like to turn to those pretty quickly. But before I do, Danny, I just wanted to ask you about one more really important element of your report, which is to just paint it with a broad brush, the various forms of withdrawal of by the US from the region, from multilateral institutions, from bilateral mechanisms of high-level exchange with China and with other countries in the region. And these seem to be an accelerant of the changes that the report describes. Tell us a little bit about some of the most significant effects that you see in this changed diplomatic landscape. And if you want to throw in a little bit of extra, maybe talk about how, so say a word about how COVID is catalyzing these changes.
Certainly. Look, I think it's really a pretty simple matter of physics, which is that as China, which by the way is right next door to Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, and South Asia, Central Asia, and is big and knows how to wield its stick as well as its carrot. As China becomes more powerful, the countries in the region are hedging. It's not just Southeast Asia. It's not just small countries. It's big countries like India and allies of the United States like Japan. What I hear constantly from friends and colleagues throughout Asia is that they don't want to be forced into a choice. They don't see this as a binary either or proposition. They certainly don't want to go in that direction. But that the willingness of governments to resist pressure from Beijing is going to be based on two calculations. One is, who's around, who's offering us the things that we need. But the other variable is their confidence in the United States. And again, far be it from me to, put words into the mouths of people in the region. But what I hear and sometimes between the lines is You know, is the United States here active right now in this region? And will the United States be trusted to stay here? Does the United States really care about us, about our interests? Are its promises going to remain valid under the next administration, whatever that is? Is the US more focused on inflicting pain and damage on China? Could the US make a U-turn and suddenly focus just on making a deal with China, the much dreaded G2 formula? Are those options more important determinants than, say, keeping faith with small countries in Asia or protecting them? And American competence, I am constantly reminded, is a factor as well. You know, does the US know what it's doing? Is it handling China cleverly, effectively, wisely, or is it just blundering around? Is it leveraging its allies and partners in an effective way, sort of marshaling a united international front, or is it tackling China head on and all by itself? And are Americans leading in, say, you know, regional or international organizations that those are organizations that I think disproportionately protect the rights of smaller countries through rules, through norms, through dispute resolutions? So I wouldn't say that the meter is pointing in the green, frankly, when it comes to regional confidence in the United States. And that's going to make a big difference. And COVID-19 has played very directly into that by further undercutting America's claim to competence and good governance. There are, I mean, history did not end. There is still a lot of uncertainty ahead. So far, COVID has been a, shall we say, a mixed blessing for China and for the BRI. It's created very significant problems for both. There was a very serious anti-China backlash in many developing countries early on, in the early weeks certainly. The economic downturn is only really beginning to hit the developing world. And these are countries, as I said, that have you know, very substantial debt to China. Many of them are now or going to be unable to service their existing debts. You know, China went along with the temporary G20 moratorium just on debt service and only for you know, a limited number of the poorest countries in the world, but has not extended that to Belt and Road. And I think when it comes to debt, China is facing a kind of Hobson's choice because you know, the option of debt forgiveness for China today, when China's own economy is under immense stress and when China's middle class is starting to ask that question that every middle class asks its government, namely, why are you pouring my hard-earned tax dollars down a foreign rat hole instead of building an elementary school for my kids? That's an expensive proposition for China. But on the other hand, pressing for repayment that may not be feasible in the developing world, or taking it out in some other form, equity and so on, that, you know, just plays into the storyline of Chinese debt trap diplomacy. It will generate local backlash, we know. So I think that COVID thus far has presented formidable challenges to China's strategy. However, the big unanswered question is what this COVID-related health Belt and Road project might grow into. The early face mask diplomacy was a bit of a disaster for a variety of reasons. But the Chinese system and the Chinese Communist Party is eminently capable of learning from its mistakes. And if, in fact, a situation emerges where the United States is heading in the direction of vaccine nationalism. You know, us first, every American who will allow him or herself to be vaccinated goes first. And the rest of you are going to have to wait. And China is pursuing a more, at least on the surface, altruistic, globalist vaccine diplomacy, making medicine available to the developing world. Then I think that the shift of the geopolitical tectonic plates is going to speed up considerably.
Hey, Susie, can I comment on that quickly?
Please.
I know you want to get to questions, but I just want to comment on Danny's point about the region as hedging based on as the power of China rises. And that power manifests itself through presence diplomatically, economic, and militarily. Juxtapose that to, in my opinion, this absence of U.S. presence that has been traditional, certainly from an economic and a diplomatic perspective. So consistency is important, and I think our friends in the region are looking for some consistency, and that's been absent. So there's been this diminishment of diplomatic, what is the region views as positive diplomatic and economic engagement. But what has been consistent and has increased is the military manifestation of U.S. foreign policy, which sends a confusing message. And those that I talk to in the region, they're confused by it, which is why you see many of them taking a much stronger leadership role than what we've seen in the past. We've certainly seen that in Australia. We've seen it on the part of Japan, other countries as well. So just to underscore Danny's point, not only is it a more assertive China with respect to its own national interest in the international domain, it's this perspective of the diminishment of the U.S. presence. And the last point I'll make is, yes, China not only learns from its mistakes, it learns very quickly from our mistakes and seizes advantage from it very quickly. So it's very difficult to move forward in a positive way when you have these impediments that we impose on ourselves that prevent us from moving forward in a positive way.
Thanks for that. Okay, I'm going to ask a couple of these questions. It looks like there are a group of them that are pretty closely related. And so any of you could take these on. But the basic question is, to what degree can China's Belt and Road Initiative be compared to US and like-minded states' historical leveraging of economic development and foreign aid strategies with other countries? That's one iteration. A slightly more pointed iteration of it is, why are you guys so obsessed with China? Aren't Chinese people allowed to seek their own national self-interest? So, floor is open to whoever wants to take that on.
I'll jump in quickly and just say from my private conversations when I was still in uniform and engagements that I had with many leaders throughout the region is that the U.S. model was very much, and there's plenty to criticize in the U.S. model, but the U.S. model was about with US AID coming in and helping build the infrastructure using local engineers, local materials, local equipment, local workers. It was really meant to bolster the framework of the country with which you were trying to assist. And the assessment of those that have accepted assistance from China, the model is very different. It's Chinese material, Chinese workers, Chinese engineers, Chinese equipment, and many times those workers are left behind to be part of a new Chinese infrastructure within the country. So I think it's very important, certainly from a U.S. foreign policy perspective. I would say the first step to get things on track is to spend a lot more time listening to what people in the region are saying. Right now, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, I think that China really is its own worst enemy. It's actually a flaw in this Belt and Road Initiative where the US model was much more of a positive. But we need to think about what the positives are, ask those that experienced it, and reshape that model into something that is a positive alternative to what others are offering.
And that brings up another question that I had maybe for you, Elina, which is, one of the kind of defining themes of Xi Jinping's leadership of China, particularly over the last couple of years, has been this idea of overreach in domestic control, possibly in foreign ambition, maybe to some extent in relations within the party leadership. And I just wonder, what does the perception of that look like from the perspective of regional neighbors, and how is that being sort of digested as a factor in decisions about how to negotiate with China over BRI projects?
Yeah, I think we've seen instances of this overreach in domestic incidents in Indonesia and Malaysia to a certain extent. They've been isolated, but the envelope has been pushed a number of times, particularly in reaching out to the Chinese, what China feels as the Chinese diaspora of these countries. Obviously, the Chinese populations, ethnic groups in Malaysia and Indonesia feel themselves to be Malaysian, Indonesian first, similarly in Singapore. But where these envelopes have been pushed, you've noticed a very quick pushback from not only the governments themselves, but also from the people of these countries. And so I think given the history with China, particularly with communism in the region, there is an unstated understanding that there are red lines that you need test sometimes, but should not be crossed. Fortunately, we're not at that point yet where China has decided to just simply test that over the line. Hopefully, we never get to that point. And I think that is why many governments do try to hedge, because given the military and other capacities in comparison to China, these sorts of instances are just completely undesirable. I did have a point about surveillance and this idea of why the US seems to be so obsessed with China when there have been global powers in the past, the US included, that have perhaps similarly manipulated or exploited these other countries themselves. And I think a lot of countries do feel this way, perhaps to different degrees, depending on the country. And that's why there is a certain level of agnosticism when it comes to purchasing tech and some of the surveillance networks that are out there. And the idea is that it is market driven. I think you've seen some instances where countries like Singapore have said, the choice of 5G is market driven and we leave that to the commercial enterprises. But there is a certain undercurrent of thinking as well that no matter which vendor you go with, whether it's the Chinese or others, you will be exposed to a certain level of risk, and it's how you mitigate and manage those risks that are first and foremost in these governments' minds.
Susie, I thought that the question that you read from the audience was an important one, and I think Admiral Swift gave a good answer, as did Elina. What I'd add as a lapsed American diplomat is that we really have to have some humility in addressing these challenges. It's not a matter of we are good and they're bad, therefore when we do it, it's fine, and when they do it, it isn't. Being cynical about China is no better than being naive about China, and unquestionably there are positive aspects to much of what China is doing, and there, even more importantly, there could be positive aspects about even more. And from ASPI as the policy institute, particularly since I and many of my colleagues are former government policymakers ourselves, we've consistently tried to identify and to point to the ways that China's rise and China's behavior can be influenced for the better, can be positively shaped. I think our goal collectively in the West and in the United States has to be to make what China is doing and offering better, and not to try to ensure that China fails.
Right, I think we have time for one quick more question. And this touches on the energy component of Belt and Road, which actually we haven't really talked much about. But the question is, can one analyze Belt and Road projects and policy with an energy policy lens, especially in the South China Sea? And if so, and maybe Admiral, you can take this one on, would we see greater militarization in those areas?
Yeah, I don't think greater militarization. Energy is critically important, and to Danny's point, we ought to look for areas of collaboration, especially when we're working with countries in the region. And what we don't want to do is to present a yes/no option, that you're either going to accept the U.S. approach to aid, or you're going to accept the Chinese approach. We need to find an overlap there, and we need to provide a compelling argument for, you know, whatever the U.S. Interests are. But one of those areas is energy. You can't talk about energy without talking about the environment. So I think those two issues need to be connected, regardless of who you're talking to, whether it's the U.S. approach, and the U.S. has a checkered history here as well. I think many have commented on a checkered history with respect to China and some of these reclaimed islands in the South China Sea. But you go back in history, World War II was really all about energy. That's where, you know, Japan was feeling pinched off. So I think that access to energy is critically important, that we need to understand it's more than economic, that if it's not working economically, people can turn to military solutions, which are invariably a very negative approach to take. So we need to think up front of how do we fulfill the energy needs of countries in the region in a meaningful way, and how can we participate in it without ignoring the environmental impacts of how we solve that problem.
Danny, maybe I'll give you just the last, about 3 minutes left, to suggest other ways in which you think that the US or other countries that have an interest in the region can most productively and humanely respond to some of the challenges that you've outlined in the report. You're on mute, Danny.
Thanks. Yes. No, I realized that. As far as the United States is concerned, I'm tempted to answer you with a string of aphorisms, beginning with eat your vegetables and get plenty of exercise. You know, what I mean is that there's simply a lot of common sense hard work that goes into developing what Admiral Swift referred to as a whole of government approach, developing an effective foreign policy and developing an effective, diplomatic system. Look at how many of our embassies in the region have gone without an ambassador. Look at how many organizations and international groupings the U.S. has played hooky from. Another aphorism is you can't win on defense. Just denouncing China, trying to block China. That's not a winning strategy. I mean, it's one thing to call out problematic behavior. It's another thing to safeguard your national security with what former Defense Secretary Bob Gates used to call a high fence and a small yard. But defense alone won't do it. Here we go again. You can't beat something with nothing, right? And I throw another one in, 80% of life is showing up. But all those sort of cliches aside, I think the broader point is that really creating and supporting a free and open Indo-Pacific, I shouldn't say creating, sustaining that, would require not only the United States, but its partners to create credible options for the countries in the region, and in some cases, credible alternatives to what China is offering. That means sustained, robust engagement, not just military, not just diplomatic, but in all domains, including educational exchange, say, including technology and investment. And all these are vital tools. I think that, as we've discussed, third country qualms about joining the United States in supporting international norms, universal rights, regional balance, something we want from them, that their qualms about this are exacerbated when they are confronted with such overt US-China rivalry. As I said, the countries throughout the region make no secret of objecting to being forced to choose sides. And they are equally clear about their fear of being caught in the crossfire between the major powers. And lastly, I would say, Susie, that referring back to a point that Admiral Swift made, sustained, authentic, high-level US-China strategic dialogue is an indispensable tool for setting limits, for deterring bad behavior, for dispelling misconceptions about each other, for building confidence, and importantly, for reducing risk. And we have got to get back to that important project.
Right. Thanks so much, Danny, for that. And thanks to Elina and to Admiral Swift for joining us, and to all of you that we can't see out there, but we're very grateful you were here with us. Again, I encourage you to take a few minutes to download the full text of the report, Weaponizing the Belt and Road, which is on Asia Society's website. Thanks so much to everybody, and have a good afternoon.